There are moments in this job that you carry home with you. Not because they were dangerous, not because someone got hurt, but because something happened that you didn't have a category for, something that cracked the silence of a formal day right down the middle and left everyone standing in the wreckage of it, not knowing whether to breathe or step back. This was one of those moments. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I've been doing this a long time. 12 years standing posts at various royal residences, starting at the Palace, then the Mews, then eventually working my way up to Clarence House under the current assignment rotation. In that time, I've seen royals lose their temper. I've seen staff cry in hallways they thought were empty. I've seen dignitaries arrive late and then pretend they hadn't. I've seen children of senior family members do things that would be tabloid front pages if any camera had been pointed the right direction. But I had never, in 12 years of standing completely still while the world moved around me, heard a royal guard speak back. Not to anyone, not once. That's the job. You stand, you watch. You don't speak unless the role absolutely requires it. You are, in the language of the household division, a presence. Not a person, not in that moment. You become something architectural, as fixed and silent as the gates you stand beside. So when it happened, the first thing I felt wasn't shock. The first thing I felt was confusion, because it took my brain a full 2 seconds to understand what I had just heard. The day started the way most of those days started. Cool. Gray. London doing that thing it does in October where the light looks like it's been left out overnight and gone slightly stale. There had been a light rain in the morning, the kind that doesn't commit, just wets the stone enough to make the whole courtyard smell like it's thinking about autumn. I came on at 7. The changeover was smooth. My colleague from the night detail, a young lad from Wiltshire, good soldier, very quiet, handed over the post notes without a word beyond the standard exchange. Nothing unusual overnight. One vehicle misrouted through the back approach, corrected before it reached the inner gate. A civilian tourist who had somehow convinced himself that Clarence House was open to walk-in visitors, sent back toward the mall with a polite redirection, and no incident. The morning moved the way those mornings do. Slow, measured, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. By 9:30, the household coordinator, a woman I'll call Mrs. Ashworth, because that's not her name but it's close enough, had been through the gate twice with a clipboard, and an expression that suggested the schedule had not cooperated with her since breakfast. She didn't speak to me. She didn't need to. I knew from the clip of her heels on the wet stone that something in the day's program had shifted. I didn't know what. That wasn't my job to know. My job was the gate. The gate and the stretch of path visible from it, and the awareness of everything that moved within that zone. That was the whole of my world from 7 until relief. At 10:43, I remember the time because I had just completed a visual sweep, and the number stuck. The way numbers do when something is about to break the routine. A car came through the inner approach. Not unusual, cars came through regularly. What was unusual was that it came in faster than the standard crawl. Not recklessly fast, but purposefully fast. The kind of speed that says something has been decided quickly, and the vehicle has been told to reflect that decision. The door opened, and she stepped out. Now I want to be careful here. Not because I'm afraid of saying something wrong, but because I want to be accurate about what I actually saw versus what I filled in afterward from context. What I saw was a woman in a pale coat, cream, or something close to it, with a handbag over one arm and the particular posture of someone who has been dealing with something unpleasant and has not finished dealing with it. The kind of posture that isn't anger exactly, but is the container that anger gets poured into when you've been doing this long enough not to show it openly. She was walking quickly. Behind her came 2 aides, one carrying a leather document folder, one with a phone already at his ear. Behind them, a protection officer in a dark suit who stayed 2 paces back, and to the left with the practiced invisibility of someone who has spent years learning how to be in a room without being in it. The group moved across the courtyard toward the entrance. And then something happened. A second vehicle, smaller, a private car, not part of the official detail, pulled in through the secondary approach, and a figure got out. This was not part of the scheduled arrival. I could tell that immediately from the way the nearest aide's head snapped around and the protection officer shifted his weight, hand moving to the inside of his jacket in that reflexive half gesture they do when something unscheduled appears. The figure from the second car was a woman, older, well-dressed. The kind of well-dressed that costs money but is trying not to look like it does. She had the air of someone who is used to being listened to, the kind of air you can feel from 30 feet away, like a pressure change. She called out, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the courtyard the way certain voices do when they've been trained, or perhaps just when they've been used to being heard for long enough. She said, and I am giving you the words as closely as I can reconstruct them, because I've thought about them since, she said. A word, if you please. I believe there has been a misunderstanding about today's arrangements, and I think it requires resolution before we proceed further. The woman in the pale coat, and by this point I had understood who she was, context having resolved the question, stopped walking. Her aide stopped. Her protection officer stopped. The whole small procession froze in that way that formal processions do when the person at the front decides to turn around. She turned, and she looked at the woman who had spoken. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has words in it that neither person is yet saying. Then the woman in the pale coat spoke. Her voice was level, controlled, the kind of control that comes from practice. She said, I think the arrangements are quite clear. And I think they were agreed upon. The other woman, the one from the second car, did not move from where she stood. She held her ground with the stillness of someone who had decided before getting out of the car that she was not going to be managed. She said they were agreed upon under a different understanding, one that has since changed. I need you to understand whatever is being proposed for the visit schedule, whatever role is being described to the household. I remain your queen. And that title carries with it a standing that I will not see quietly redistributed. Everything in the courtyard went still. And I mean that in the specific sense, not metaphorically. Literally, the aide with the phone lowered it from his ear. The one with the folder stopped shuffling papers. The protection officer's hand dropped back to his side. Even the sound of the city outside the gate seemed to pause, the way city sound sometimes does between gusts of wind, leaving a gap of complete silence. Into that silence, from the post where I was standing, 10 feet to the left of the central approach path, and technically not involved in any of what was happening. My colleague spoke. I need to explain something about my colleague before I tell you what he said. He was not a young guard. He was not someone who had been on the job 3 months and hadn't yet learned the weight of silence. He was senior. He had been doing this longer than I had. He was the kind of man who, if you'd asked him on any other morning what the most important quality of the position was, would have said without hesitation, stillness, the ability to be completely present and completely invisible at the same time. He was also, and this is not something I say lightly, a man of quiet principle. I had worked enough shifts alongside him to know that. He never said much. But when he did speak, it was because something needed to be said that no one else was going to say. He spoke 2 sentences. They were not loud. They were not aggressive. They were delivered in the flat, measured tone of someone making a factual observation. He said, with respect, Your Majesty, both of your titles are correct. But only one of them is why you're standing in this courtyard today. And then he returned to stillness, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just, in the space of 2 sentences, said the most precisely aimed, diplomatically devastating thing that had been said in that courtyard in years. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. The one before had been full of tension, of held breath, of 2 women measuring each other across 20 feet of wet stone. This one was full of something else entirely. The woman in the pale coat looked at the guard, just for a moment. Her expression didn't change, not in any way that I could name, but something moved behind her eyes. Something that might have been surprise or recognition, or the particular feeling you get when someone has said something so precisely accurate that you don't have an immediate response for it. The woman who had spoken about her title, the one who had said, I remain your queen, also looked at the guard. Her expression was harder to read. There was a quality to it that I can only describe as recalibration. The look of someone who has walked into a room expecting a certain kind of conversation and discovered that the room had different dimensions than expected. The protection officer had gone entirely neutral, the practiced blankness of someone who has been trained to be invisible in exactly this kind of moment. The aide with the folder had, I noticed, looked down at the folder. The aide with the phone was looking at the sky. For approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a courtyard when nobody is moving, nobody spoke. Then the woman in the pale coat made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. It was a sound that carries acknowledgement in it the way a nod does, when a nod is the only honest response to something. She said quietly, "Perhaps we should take this inside." The woman who had arrived in the second car considered that for a moment. Then she nodded. And that was that. The procession reformed, both women their respective attendants, the protection officer, they moved toward the entrance. The door was held open. They went through. The courtyard was empty again. My colleague had not moved from his post. He did not look at me. I did not look at him. We stood, the way we always do. But here's the thing, and this is what I carry home with me, on the nights when the day's been long and the job has worn its particular weight into my back and my shoulders and my feet. He was right. That's what broke the silence. That's what cracked open that moment in the courtyard. Not the confrontation itself. Those happen in various forms in every institution where power is both formal and inherited, and therefore constantly in negotiation with itself. Not the woman claiming her title, that was understandable, even if the method was not ideal. What broke it open was the accuracy of what my colleague said. A title tells you what someone was given. A reason for being in a courtyard tells you what they're trying to do. And sometimes, in the quiet, unglamorous, formally dressed reality of what we witness from these posts, those two things are not the same. He saw that, and in the 12 years I've been doing this job, that's the only time I've ever seen a royal guard say what needed to be said. Not what was permitted, what was needed. There's a difference. And on that gray October morning, with the rain-wet stone beneath our boots and the city going on with its business just past the gate, that difference mattered. You'd think the courtyard was where it ended. That's what I thought too, for the first few minutes after both women went through the main entrance and the door settled shut behind them with that precise, padded click that those old doors make, the sound of something very heavy moving with perfect balance. I thought, well, that happened, and now it's over. I was wrong. What happened inside the building over the next 40 minutes was not something I witnessed directly. I want to be clear about that. What I'm telling you now comes from two people, both of whom were in the inner hall that morning, both of whom I know personally, both of whom described the same events independently without coordinating their accounts. I'll tell it the way it was told to me. The inner hall at Clarence House is not a large space. It's formal without being grandiose, the kind of room that has been arranged to suggest importance without announcing it. There are portraits. There is dark wood. There is the smell that old official buildings develop over decades, a smell of polish and dried flowers, and something underneath both of those that is harder to name, the smell, maybe, of accumulated formality. On that morning, the hall was occupied by a small number of household staff going about the ordinary business of a working morning. A coordinator, a senior aide. 2 junior staff members processing what my source described as a large quantity of correspondence, which he said is always more physical than you expect. Actual paper, actual envelopes, actual stamps, which still exist in that world and are used more than you'd think. The 2 women entered together, which was itself notable, given that they had arrived separately and the preceding exchange in the courtyard had not suggested agreement was imminent. They were not talking, but they were walking in the same direction. My source, I'll call her the coordinator because that's essentially what she was, said that the room shifted when they came in. Not dramatically. Just the subtle thing that happens when 2 people of significant formal weight enter any enclosed space simultaneously. And the people already in the room have to quietly recalibrate who to acknowledge first, and in what order and how. The answer is, you acknowledge the senior person first. The difficulty was, which one was that? This is where the morning became complicated in a different way. The woman in the pale coat, and I'm going to use the name the coordinator used when she told me this, which was simply Her Majesty, because that's what the staff called her, and protocol in that house is not something that gets abandoned because a situation is awkward, took a position near the fireplace. Not aggressive, not performative. Just placed herself there with the ease of someone who has been in this room many times and knows where she belongs in it. The other woman, whom the coordinator referred to throughout simply as the visitor, which tells you something about how the staff read the situation, stood near the entrance to the side corridor. She had not removed her coat. This was noted. In those environments, removing your coat signals that you intend to stay for a considered period. Keeping it on means something else. There was a brief exchange between them, low-voiced. The coordinator was not close enough to hear the content, only the tone, and she described the tone as careful. The kind of careful that people use when they're aware that there are other people in the room, and the other people are trying not to listen too obviously. Then the door to the private corridor opened, and a member of the household, a senior figure, someone both women knew, someone who had been in that house long enough to understand the layout of its politics as well as its architecture, stepped through. This person, my source said, looked at the room and understood it in about 2 seconds. He looked at the woman by the fireplace. He looked at the visitor by the corridor entrance. And then he said, in a voice that was calm and neither addressed to one nor the other, but to the room in general, "I think we might be most comfortable if we moved through." He held the door. After a pause, and my source noted the length of the pause, which she described as longer than it should have been by at least 3 seconds, both women moved toward the door. In what order, she couldn't see. The door closed. What happened beyond it, she doesn't know. The second source, I'll call him the junior aide, was positioned differently that morning. His role had him moving between the inner hall and the service corridor that runs parallel to the private rooms, and in doing that transit, he passed through a short, connecting passage twice in the period when the two women were inside. The first time he passed through, he heard voices, formal, even, the kind of exchange that sounds composed but has an undercurrent of something. The second time, approximately 20 minutes later, he heard something different. He heard laughter. Not loud, not the performed laughter of a gathering where everyone is pretending to enjoy themselves. Something smaller than that. Something that, he said, sounded more like the laugh that comes out of a situation that has finally been named honestly. When he came back through the hall, the visitor's coat was gone from the stand near the entrance. He checked the front approach through the window. Her car was still there. She had stayed. Now, here's what I want to say about that. I don't know what was said in that private room. Nobody told me. Nobody was going to. That's not how those houses work, and it's not how it should work, and honestly, I don't think knowing the content would change what I took away from that morning anyway. What I think happened, and this is my reading, formed from 12 years of watching the edges of these moments without ever being at the center of them, is this. The exchange in the courtyard had done something that the long, careful, diplomatically managed conversation that had probably been scheduled for some time later that week had not yet managed to do. It had been honest, not in the way that formal honesty is, the kind where everything true is wrapped in enough hedging and politeness that the truth becomes something you have to excavate from the phrasing, but in the way that only happens when someone outside the arrangement says something that neither party inside it has been willing to say. My colleague from his post in the courtyard had effectively said, "You're both right, but you're arguing about the wrong question." And sometimes, in rooms full of portraits and dark wood and the smell of accumulated formality, that's the thing that finally lets a conversation start. I went off shift at 3. The junior aide caught up with me as I was walking toward the staff exit. He didn't say much. He had a particular look on his face that I recognized, the look of someone who has witnessed something they're still processing. He said, "Did you hear what your man said this morning, in the courtyard?" I said I had. He thought about that for a second. Then he said, "Did he get in trouble?" And honestly, that was the question I'd been turning over all day. Because what my colleague had done was, by any strict reading of the rules, completely outside the parameters of the role. Guards don't speak. They don't interject. They don't offer commentary on the conversations of the people they're standing near. They are a presence, not a participant. He had become a participant. And in doing so, even though what he said was true and necessary and the kind of thing that probably needed saying, he had technically broken something. I told the aide I didn't know. I told him I'd find out. I found out the next morning. The protocol officer came by the post at 8. He was a compact man, efficient in his movements, the kind of person who communicates a great deal through posture and very little through volume. He stopped beside my colleague without preamble. He said, "Yesterday morning." My colleague said, "Yes, sir." The protocol officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Going forward." And that was it. He walked away. My colleague and I stood in silence for another minute. Then I said quietly, without turning my head, because you don't turn your head on post, "What does that mean?" "Going forward." My colleague didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, "I think it means it happened, and we're all moving forward from it." Neither of those things was a reprimand. Neither of them was an endorsement. It was the institutional version of the sound the woman in the pale coat had made, that not quite laugh, not quite sigh. The acknowledgement that something had happened, it had been noted, and now everyone was going to proceed. That, in those environments, is its own kind of answer. I've thought about why he did it. I've had a lot of shifts to think about it. Standing still gives you that, not emptiness, but a kind of uninterrupted space for turning things over. I think it was this. He had been in the position long enough to know the difference between a conversation that was about power and a conversation that was dressed as being about power. What he heard in the courtyard was the second kind. The question of who held which title, and which title granted which standing, and whether standing could be redistributed, all of that was real. Those were real stakes. But underneath it, what was actually happening was two people trying to find where they fit relative to each other in a structure that had recently shifted, and finding that neither of them had a comfortable place to stand. And he had said in 2 sentences what that actually was. Not as a judgment, not as an intervention, as an observation. The kind of observation you can only make when you've spent years watching things, without being involved in them. When you've been still long enough to see what's actually moving. The last thing my source, the coordinator, told me when I spoke to her a week after the event was small. She said that in the days following that morning, she had noticed a difference in the way the household operated. Subtle, the kind of thing you only notice because you've been in a place long enough to feel its rhythms. She said the communication between the two camps, between the visitors and the permanent staff, between the two women and their respective people, had become slightly less careful, not less polite, less armored. The kind of shift that happens when people have acknowledged a thing that was previously unacknowledged and can now move around it instead of pretending it isn't in the middle of the floor. She said someone opened a window, I don't know who. But the room was less stuffy afterward. I thought about my colleague standing at his post. 2 sentences. An open window. That's a strange kind of power to have, the power of a word offered from the right distance. Not too close to be invested in the outcome. Not too far to understand what's happening. Just far enough to see it clearly. Just near enough to speak. 6 weeks after that morning in the courtyard, my colleague applied for reassignment. He didn't tell me he was going to, he didn't mention it. I found out the way you find out about most things in that environment, indirectly through the small shifts in the administrative pattern. A change to the rota. A name removed from one column and added to another. The quiet paperwork of movement. When I asked him about it, carefully, on a slow afternoon when there was nothing in the courtyard, and the city outside the gate had settled into that particular afternoon stillness, he didn't answer for a while. Then he said, "I've done what I was going to do here." I didn't ask him what that meant. Partly because I knew he wouldn't expand on it, partly because I thought I understood it. There are people who can stand beside a thing for a long time, watchful, patient, saying nothing. And there are moments that are waiting for exactly that, for someone to have seen enough, and stood long enough, and gathered enough quiet certainty to say the one thing that the moment needs. Once you've said it, the moment passes. And then you move on. I want to tell you about the day he left. It was early November. The mornings had gone sharp by then, the kind of cold that has edges to it, that finds the gap between your collar and your jaw and stays there. The sky was doing what November skies do, an even, pale gray, the color of old pewter without depth or drama, just present. He was on the morning shift, last one before the reassignment. I happened to be on changeover, coming in to relieve the overnight post, and our paths crossed in the usual way. The brief, formal exchange. the handover of the post notes, the minimal acknowledgement that passes for a farewell in environments where sentimentality is considered a kind of professional noise. He handed me the notes. I took them. He started to go. Then he stopped, and he did something he had not done in all the shifts we'd worked alongside each other. He turned back and looked at me directly. Not the sweep of attention that's part of the job, the visual sweep, the awareness check. He looked at me the way people look at you when they're saying something with the look that they're not going to say with words. I nodded. He nodded. He left. The post notes were standard. Nothing unusual overnight. No incidents. One tourist misdirected from the public entrance, corrected. One delivery vehicle early on approach, held at the outer gate until the correct time window. At the bottom in his handwriting, not the standard printed form, but handwritten in the margin, which he had never done before, was a single line. It said, "Watch the courtyard carefully. The interesting things happen in the quiet." That's it, that's all. I kept the note. Now, in the weeks since he left, I've been thinking about what actually happened on that October morning. Not the politics of it, not the question of titles and standing, and the careful negotiation of position that happens in those houses the way weather happens. Constantly, invisibly, and with occasional sharp events that remind you it was always there. I've been thinking about the quieter thing underneath it. Which is this: he had been asked by the nature of his role to be a wall, not literally. But that's what the job demands, that you become a defined edge, a boundary, a thing with no opinions and no reactions and no responses beyond the strictly required. You stand between the public world and the private world. You are the membrane. On that morning, the membrane spoke. And the strange thing, the thing I keep coming back to, is that it worked. Not despite the breach of protocol. Maybe in some way I don't fully understand because of it. Because both women in that courtyard had been talking to each other, and talking past each other, in the language of rank and precedent and title, and neither was getting through. And what my colleague said, in the flat, careful voice of someone who had no skin in the game, no position to protect, no outcome to secure, cut through that particular fog. He was credible precisely because he was supposed to be silent. The walls of a room can say things that the people inside it can't. Not often, not as a habit, but sometimes, when the room has gone still enough and the thing that needs saying has been waiting long enough, a wall speaks. The coordinator told me one more thing. About a month after the incident, she had been in the private office, collecting a file. She wasn't meant to stay. It was a quick errand, in and out, nothing that required her attention to the room beyond finding what she needed and leaving. But she paused, because on the mantel of the fireplace where the woman in the pale coat had stood on that morning, where the whole interior chapter of the day had begun, there was something new. A small framed photograph. She didn't look closely. She knew better than that. But the image was clear enough as she moved past. Two women, outdoors, some formal occasion, standing in close proximity and smiling in the way that people smile when the photographer has caught them at a genuine moment rather than a composed one. She didn't know when the photo had been taken. She didn't know when it had been placed there. She went back to her desk and processed her file and said nothing. But she told me. And when she told me, she had the look of someone who has seen something small and has understood it to be not small at all. I think about what my colleague said a lot. Not because I'm likely to say it. I'm not that man. I haven't earned that kind of certainty. I still think my job is to be the wall, and I think that's right, most of the time, for most of us in most moments. But I carry what he showed me. That there is a difference between silence as abdication and silence as preparation. That a person who watches without speaking, who stands without moving, who stays in the cold and the rain and the flat November light and keeps the gate and holds the post, that person isn't empty. That person is full of everything they've seen, full of everything they've understood without announcing it, full of the accumulated weight of all the human things that have moved past them while they stayed still. And sometimes, rarely with care, at exactly the right moment. All of that can come out in 2 sentences and change the temperature of an entire room. I don't know where my colleague went. Reassignments don't come with forwarding addresses. I hope the post is quieter. I hope the mornings are easier on the back. I hope he found whatever it was he was looking for when he decided he was done doing what he was going to do here. I hope on some gray morning like that October one, he stops somewhere, on a path, on a step, on whatever patch of ground he's been assigned, and he just stands. And watches. And thinks about the courtyard. The way I do. Because that's where it happened. That quiet strip of wet stone between the gate and the door, with the city going about its business on the other side, and two women measuring their ground and a guard standing where he always stood, invisible as furniture, patient as architecture. A wall that found its voice, and said the one true thing.